Hey guys, I wanted to explain a simpler way than you probably already know about how to understand delta delta. And I chose today because my hair be looking fly today. Anyway, so hopefully the video actually turns out okay, because I will not get this hairstyle again in a bit. So, ignore the cat. So, metabolic acidosis. The reason you have a low bicarb is because either you're losing bicarb, as in you have GI losses or renal losses of your bicarb, for instance, or you have an additional unmeasured anion, and that's what's lowering your bicarb. So either you have a GI losses, some kind of losses of your bicarb, or an additional unmeasured anion. So the first type is that when you're losing your bicarb from the GI system or from the kidneys, that's the normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Loss of bicarb. So either you're having diarrhea or you're having an RTA. So that's how you're losing bicarb from the kidney. Or actually, if you're also adding chloride to, that also causes a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. So like if you're giving saline. So either you have a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis or you have a high anion gap metabolic acidosis, and that's when you're adding some other anion to the system, and that's what's lowering your bicarb. So in a high anion gap metabolic acidosis, remember I said the reason that your bicarb is low is because you're adding an unmeasured anion. That means that every time you add one to the anion gap, you add an unmeasured anion, that's like your bicarb should go down by 1. So every time your anion gap goes up by 1, your bicarb should go down by 1. So every time I add an unmeasured anion, as in my anion gap number calculation goes up by 1 from normal, my bicarb should go down by 1 in a pure high anion gap metabolic acidosis. What do I mean by going up from normal versus going down from normal? So if, for example, we're saying a normal anion gap is 10, I know we could say like 10 or 12. So suppose we say normal anion gap is 10. If I look at my patient, my anion gap is actually 11, it went up by 1, that means my expected bicarb should go down by 1. So it should go down from normal of a bicarb of 24 down to 23. So if my anion gap is 11, so it went up by 1, my bicarb should go down by 1 from normal of 24, so it should be 23. If my anion gap is 14, for example, so it went up from normal from 10 by 4, my bicarb should also go down by 4. So from 24 to 10. So my expected bicarb should be 20. So what happens if then you look back at your patient, you look at their labs, and their bicarb's actually much higher than you expected, that's an additional metabolic alkalosis. If their bicarb is lower than you expected, that's an additional normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. So let's do an example. Anion gap for my patient is 20. Bicarb for my patient is 5. So how much did my anion gap go up by from a normal of 10? My anion gap went up by 10 from 10 to 20. So that means I would expect my bicarb to also go down by 10 from a normal of 24 down to 14. So my expected bicarb is 14. Now I look back at my patient. Their actual bicarb is 5. So what that means is that the actual bicarb is much lower than I expected. Low bicarb, metabolic acidosis. So that means there's an additional normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Suppose my actual bicarb was much higher than 14. That would mean there's an additional metabolic alkalosis. This concept is the delta-delta. It just makes a little more sense to me. So remember what you learned about delta-delta, if you learned about it. So delta-delta is your delta anion gap divided by your delta bicarb. And if that's high, that's a metabolic alkalosis, additional metabolic alkalosis. If it's low, they tell you it's an additional normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. The reason the way I do it is equivalent is because this delta, the delta anion gap divided by the delta bicarb, that's just saying, like with our last example, the delta anion gap was 10. So that it should also be the same as the delta bicarb. So it should be 1. If that ratio is off, that's when you have an additional process going on. That's either raising your bicarb or lowering your bicarb. So I think that should be it. Just remember, there's a little bit of wiggle room, and that's why it's really that your bicarb could actually be a lot higher than expected before it counts as a metabolic alkalosis, and that's why this ratio, the delta could be more than 2, but really, this is honestly an easier way of thinking of delta. Hope that helps. Thanks.